So we'll now move on to the next talk of this session. And I will invite the two Thomases. Thomas Godfrey from King's College, where he's doing his PhD under the Drive Health Studentship Scheme, and then Thomas Mead from Francis Crick Institute and King's College, who is a PhD candidate as well with a background in biochemistry and bioinformatics. And Thomases will talk to us about building DSLs for agent-based models. Over to you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll just step right into it. Good. Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking to you about using JetBrains MPS for building DSLs to create agent-based simulations. So this really is what I want you to take away from our project. Basically, simulations are really useful in numerous scientific domains, specifically agent-based models, but oftentimes building them requires technical skills and understanding that can be rare amongst domain experts. And to address this gap, we are going to use JetBrains MPS to create domain-specific modeling language to overcome the gap in technical knowledge. And hopefully this will enable domain experts to quickly and effectively create their own understandable simulations. So I'm just going to step right in. So if you're not aware, agent-based models are a type of computer simulation where actors, otherwise known as agents, are simulated en masse to generate emergent behaviors. And one usually has to define things like the types of agents that you're simulating, the world that they exist in, and the rules of their interaction to generate these emergent behaviors. Agent-based models are used widely in a variety of domains, such as logistics, finance, and even biology, which I'll be talking to you about in a second. But even with specialized tools, creating agent-based models can be challenging for domain experts. There are tools that exist that theoretically let developers create ABMs quickly, such as NetLogo, but using these tools tends to require either some level of coding expertise, or they discuss concepts in too vague terms to be useful for specific problems. And it's our belief that we can use domain-specific languages to address this problem. So this you're probably all familiar with, but the main reason why we're interested in using domain-specific languages is that they have a very restricted scope and a specific syntax compared to general programming languages like Python or C++. And we think that this could greatly improve the experience of building agent-based models for domain experts, because domain-specific languages can use any syntax that you define. They're inherently more understandable than general programming languages to non-coders. And because you restrict your ideas to a specific domain, they are going to be easier to learn because there is less for them to learn. And hopefully, once you've built your model, these are going to be instantly recognizable to other domain experts. And this is really vital for building trustable models, is having them be able to be interrogated by other experts in your field. And as Vaclav sort of very expertly explained, JetBrains MPS is, well, it's the tool we've chosen, and it is a language workbench which lets you create domain-specific languages. And the reason why we've chosen MPS for this application is that it uses something called projectional editing to represent ideas in a language. And what's really cool about this is that you can represent the same ideas. So, for example, I've gotten a concept in MPS, a fraction, for example, that I want to have in my language, and I can change how this is presented to users depending on the specific context. So you can have your fraction sort of represented, you know, with a numerator on top and a denominator on bottom. You can have it like this as your write code, or you can even, if you're feeling cruel, have it written out in text. But once you have your concept and how you represent this to your users, what you can then do is translate this directly into code. And this is something that I leverage in my project quite a lot. And essentially, we are hoping we can use MPS to create DSLs that are instantly familiar to the domain experts that we are interacting with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my project and its sort of relation to building domain-specific language for an ABM. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I am also attached to the Francis Crick Institute, and I'm part of a lab which studies a process known as angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels from existing ones. And as it turns out, like a lot of processes in biology, it's a very highly non-linear process with a lot of communication between the cells that make up the blood vessels and intricate shape dynamics that eventually affect the topology of a network as it's sprouting. So one example of these shape dynamics, as you can see, are these really long protrusions known as Filopodia. And as it turns out, these are vital for cells in the blood vessel to work out where in the environment it's supposed to grow to. And also, as it turns out, angiogenesis is implicated in many disease processes, and I've listed just a few of them here. So cancer is obviously the big one, with new blood vessels growing into tumors, basically being necessary for them to grow past a certain size. And as you might expect, understanding how this process works is really important for designing new therapies for these diseases. So our lab uses an agent-based model called the mem-agent spring model to study angiogenesis. And essentially, this agent-based model represents cells in a blood vessel as a collection of individual agents that make up the membrane of the cell. And what it does also is it represents connections between these as springs, which lets the cell move elastically and to do things like generate these really intricate Filopodia dynamics that you can see in the bottom half of this image that I have here. Over time, the simulation has been used in a wide variety of different contexts. So one such study was when you change the timing of the selection of a cell to essentially initiate a new blood vessel, this changes the entire topology of a network. And over time, more and more features have been added to this model at the request of collaborators to apply it to more and more contexts. But you can probably see what the issue with this sort of process for talking to other people are is if you're a biologist who's interested in using the model, it requires not only using the model yourself and extending the model yourself, you're going to need two things. You're going to need the knowledge to code new things in the language that it's written in, as it happens at C++. And you have to be familiar with the overall layout of the model itself. So at the moment, if you're a new user, you might find that features that control protrusion behavior are split up across different files. And a lot of the technical aspects that you need to run the simulation are mixed with biological ideas. So one example is that we use something called the cellular POTS model, which is essentially a thermodynamic model that lets cells rearrange along the vessel as it's progressing. But a biologist would never talk about a cellular POTS model. They would talk about cells rearranging. So we want to describe this in terms that they would inherently understand. And the last point is, naturally, C++ is fairly rare amongst biologists. That's not to say you don't come across it, but most often it will be you'll encounter people who know how to use statistical languages like R. So unless you want the person you're collaborating with to sit down for 3 months to learn C++, you're not going to get very far collaborating with them. So our hope is that we can address all three of these concerns with the DSL. So so I'm just going to go through the problems one by one. So with features that are split up across multiple files, you can sort of regiment these features into clearly defined and recognizable concepts that people will understand quickly. You can restrict what a user interacts with so that they only interact with biological ideas rather than technical aspects of the simulation. And you can also write your DSL in a far clearer syntax than you would in anything in C++. And our hope is that this impacts the understandability, trustability, and the learnability of the model all at once. So to that end, I have been hard at work writing 3 sub-languages in MPS, which essentially target each of the three concerns that you might have when building an agent-based model. So for example, I have a world language that lets you describe objects in the simulation world, such as signals in the environment that cells can respond to, and sort of objects in the environment that cells are able to adhere to and move around on. I've written a language that lets users describe the types of tissues that they're going to expect in their simulation and where they are found. And I've also written a language that lets users describe protein signaling pathways. And this sort of harkens back to the three sort of concerns that one might have when writing agent-based models. For example, with the world language, you describe the environment that your agents are in. With tissue language, you can describe what your agents are and where they are. And finally, with a signaling language, you can describe essentially what happens when cells and agents interact. So in fact, sort of subdividing this out into three sub-languages has really let us target the specific concerns that you have when writing an agent-based model in this way. And as I mentioned at the start, one of the reasons why we chose MPS for this particular problem was that you can utilize projectional editing to make concepts a lot more familiar to users. So if you, for example, you've got a set of cellular components and interact, you might want to write it out as text and have it explicitly written out. But a lot of the time, if you're a biologist, you don't present this sort of information in this way to other biologists. You would present it as a diagram, which shows how things interact. And the ability to change between these on the fly with MPS is really handy, and that's something that I hope will eventually be useful to users once they start using it. And you can and I'm at the stage now where I'm able to generate new types of simulation with the tool as well. So one example that I've been working on is trying to replicate this particular cellular communication pathway from a previous publication. And I have been using MPS to generate C++ code that runs ordinary differential equations of all the levels of these particular components at once. And then I've been trying to go back and compare them to previous experiments that have been done with other models. So, and finally, this is just a screen grab from an older version that I had, and it sort of demonstrates the fact that not only are you able to describe new configurations of your tissues, excuse me, but you're able to do it in any configuration that you want. At that point, I think I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk to you about his project now.
Yeah, great, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my project in this next bit. It's going to be fairly brief, to be honest. But next slide, please. So the idea of my project is to try and integrate agent-based simulation as a tool for decision-making in hospitals, specifically decision-making about infection control. We'd like to create a system whereby healthcare staff, such as senior clinicians and infection control staff, can use simulation to test some operational changes to their work and evaluate if that would be likely to succeed in the real world. So this could include things like testing new infection control measures, such as patient testing schemes, changes to patient care pathways and treatment plans, or things like actually rearranging the rooms in a hospital ward to try and reduce the risk of disease spread. Next slide, please. And so also like Tom, I'm developing DSMLs to help address this. In my case, DSLs that are aimed at capturing human processes in the hospital and to be used by healthcare staff. So what would these look like? We have called our DSML the healthcare language, and it's split up into a modular set of smaller DSLs. Each of these individual modules have their own role in capturing different domain processes. So one of them is called the built environment language, and this is for defining kind of the physical layout of the hospital. So where different rooms are, where resources are in those rooms. We also have the action card language, which is used for defining like care pathways for patients. So what are the different actions that have to happen during the patient's treatment, from them arriving to the hospital to either being admitted somewhere or being discharged. And then finally, we have a set of small strategy languages that are used for more auxiliary processes. Things like staff decision-making about what patient they want to see next, what action they'll do next if there are multiple options, and kind of smaller things like that. So in this next part, I'll just cover basically the most developed of these languages, the action card language. Next slide, please. So during my time working with hospital staff, one thing that kept cropping up quite often was the use of what they call action cards. And action cards are essentially these flowcharts that describe the different actions that staff need to perform with their patients in different scenarios. So on the left, I've included an action card from last winter during kind of peak COVID prevalence. It's basically describing, these are the tests that we need to do for the patient. And then based on the test outcomes, this is where they should be admitted to, either kind of a main ward or a side room so that they're isolated away from other people. These type of visualizations, these action cards, are really common in the hospital. They're updated constantly and they're used for a whole variety of different processes. As such, we know that this kind of notation is very familiar to healthcare staff. And so we decided to use this as a basis for our action card DSL. So our action card language is a graphical language, similar to a flowchart drawing tool. Each action card can have multiple actions, and these are connected by branches which may or may not have conditions attached to them. So they could be conditions like the health status of a patient. Are they healthy? Are they not healthy? It could be on test results. It could be on resource availability, those kind of things. And the user can actually interact with this, and they can click on an action to view more details and actually fill out kind of those extra details, such as how long the action takes, where that action should be performed typically, what staff are involved, and if it uses any resources. Next slide, please. The idea then would be that the user defines a process that they want to capture using that action card language and the extra built language and strategy languages if it's appropriate. And then this will get generated into an agent-based model. So to give you a bit of an idea of what that would look like, on this slide is a screen grab of a simulation that was generated from our DSLs. So I'm personally using Repath Symphony as the underlying architecture. And so here you can see the Repath Symphony UI, which kind of comes as standard. On the left, the user has options of changing how fast the simulation runs and also entering some model parameters if they wish. And then on the right, we have kind of a visualization of the actual simulation running. So in this case, this is a very, very abstract representation of the emergency department at St. Thomas Hospital. We have different rooms as different colored squares, and then walls as those black lines between them, and agents as the small colored circles. So you have kind of nurses, doctors, triage nurses, and then patients. During the model runs, the user can actually see their hospital environment represented in the simulation and watch the agents move around and complete the sequence of tasks that they defined in their DSL. We also then have data outputs such as how long were patients spending in the hospital, the results of different tests that they used, the number of admissions, and where the patients were admitted to. So staff can then use these output metrics to compare different interventions and use the results to determine if a real-world intervention would be worth exploring further. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's my case study, but now to our conclusions. In this talk, we've demonstrated two different DSLs for agent-based model development, but across two different domains. In Tom's case, he's building a DSL on top of an already existing model, whereas I'm basically starting from scratch. There's kind of no underlying model there already. In both cases, though, we've been able to benefit from using DSLs to improve the accessibility of simulation modeling as a process. Namely, we believe our DSLs improve the trust domain users have in this technology, so in using agent-based modeling. We've improved the degree to which the users understand how ABMs work and how outputs are generated, and also the ease at which users can learn how to develop their agent-based models. So for our particular domain, another thing we found is that graphical languages kind of resonated best with our users. I think typically if you see a big wall of text, it can be a bit daunting. So kind of graphical interfaces tended to be more favorable. But on top of that, we found that we did need kind of text-based syntaxes to kind of work in tandem to cover the required domain concepts for our models. Next slide, please. So we're also both using MPS for our DSLs. And so I just wanted to highlight the benefits and negatives that we've had with our experiences of MPS. The good parts, the projectional editor is just really flexible, really nice to use, and allowed us to combine different syntax styles from the same base concepts. I think Tom demonstrated that in his section there, just really helpful. Another thing is that the modular approach to language development in MPS is really clean and easy to use. Rather than us refactoring kind of one big DSL, we can have these modular set of smaller languages that extend each other. In terms of negatives, the big one really is that although the community around MPS is really active and willing to help, documentation can be difficult to find. Often documentation is scattered here and there in different websites and forums. So it can be difficult to find answers to specific questions you might have. And so to basically plug our own work a bit here, it's for this issue that we're working on a new resource, a new learning resource for using MPS that will go on MDENet. This will include usage guides and common issues and fixes. We're not going to kind of reinvent the wheel here, and we will reference documentation where it already exists. But the idea is trying to structure this documentation and create a central repository for people to find what they are looking for. And we expect this to be ready around March, so please keep an eye on MDENet for that. Thank you very much.